What if I told you that in one of the most unstable regions on earth, a quiet, unknown soldier, barely in his 30s, overthrew a government, defied colonial powers, and became Africa's youngest leader? No wealth, no famous family name, just grit, loyalty from his troops, and the will to take back a country under siege. This is not fiction. This is the real story of Captain Ibrahim Traoré and the revolution he ignited. Ibrahim Traoré's story doesn't begin in a palace. There were no golden gates, no formal education in elite French institutions, no powerful relatives to pull the strings of influence. His story begins in Bondokuy, a remote commune tucked within the Boucle du Mohun region in western Burkina Faso, a place many outside the country have never heard of. Bondokuy is rural, quiet, and often overlooked. The streets are more dust than pavement. Livelihoods here are simple: subsistence farming, cattle herding, maybe a local market that wakes with the sunrise and closes before the heat becomes unbearable. It's here that Traoré learned the first principles that would define his life: discipline, humility, and survival. Born in 1988, just a year after the assassination of revolutionary leader Thomas Sankara, Traoré grew up in a Burkina Faso, wrestling with identity. It was a nation still shadowed by colonialism, rattled by coups, and disconnected from its people's basic needs. But in the mind of a young boy growing up in Bondokuy, dreams can thrive even where the soil is cracked. Traoré's early education is reported to have been remarkably focused. In interviews with those who knew him during his youth, a consistent description emerges: quiet, intelligent, and extremely disciplined. His academic aptitude stood out in a village where higher education was a distant luxury. He was not the loudest in the room, but his seriousness earned respect. He would later enroll at the University of Ouagadougou, studying geology, a field far from the military path he would ultimately walk. Geology may sound unremarkable in the context of coups and power struggles, but it speaks volumes about the kind of thinker Traoré is. Geology is about patience, observation, understanding pressure, layers, and the forces that shape the earth over time. One might say it was an unintentional metaphor for the life he was preparing to live. But books and labs couldn't silence the instability outside university gates. As Burkina Faso grappled with rising terrorist threats and deteriorating security, many young men were compelled to act, not as scholars, but as soldiers. Traoré was among them. After university, he joined the Burkinabe army, entering a new world, one of hierarchy, strategy, and constant risk. It wasn't long before his aptitude and loyalty earned him a place in the elite artillery regiment. Traoré was not a headline soldier. He wasn't flashy. He didn't hunger for public appearances. But within military circles, he was quickly recognized for his tactical intelligence and quiet leadership. He would go on to serve in some of the most dangerous parts of the Sahel region, including Mali, under the G5 Sahel Joint Force, a multinational force formed to combat insurgents in the region. These deployments hardened him. He saw firsthand the failures of regional governments to protect their people. He witnessed comrades die. He saw villages burned and promises broken. And perhaps most importantly, he saw the disconnect between decisions made in capital cities and the blood spilled on dusty village roads. Those years in uniform, fighting a war few in the world paid attention to, shaped his worldview that leadership isn't about speeches or power. It's about defending the people who trust you with their lives. As terrorist groups tightened their grip on Burkina Faso's rural regions, faith in the political elite plummeted. Each new attack, each displacement, each military funeral added fuel to a fire already smoldering in Traoré's generation. A growing frustration with leaders who seemed more loyal to Paris than to Ouagadougou. He didn't yet know it, but destiny was quietly setting the stage. From Bondokuy to the barracks, from textbooks to bulletproof vests, Traoré was moving toward a role he never publicly sought, but one that history would soon demand of him. By the time Ibrahim Traoré had finished his training and began his deployments, Burkina Faso was unraveling. It didn't happen overnight. In the early 2000s, tens, jihadist groups that had once been confined to northern Mali began creeping across porous borders. Like shadows slipping past barbed wire, they arrived in the Sahel region, bringing with them a new kind of war, not one fought with tanks or jets, but one of ambushes, mines, executions, and fear. Burkina Faso had always been vulnerable, a landlocked country with weak infrastructure, a young population, and a fragile democracy barely 2 decades old. But few were prepared for what was coming. By 2015, jihadist insurgents, some aligned with Al-Qaeda, others pledging allegiance to ISIS, began launching deadly attacks on villages, schools, police outposts, and even places of worship. Entire communities were erased overnight. Teachers were beheaded in front of students. Roads were littered with improvised explosive devices. IEDs, mosques, and churches were both turned into battlegrounds. Traoré, unlike many officers, did not operate from behind the desks. He was known for leading from the front. His men respected him, not just for his tactics, but for sharing their hardship. He marched with them, ate with them, bled with them. As the situation worsened, something began to shift in Traoré. According to former colleagues, he grew increasingly frustrated with the lack of action from the central government, particularly from President Roch Kabore and his military hierarchy. Meanwhile, France's military presence, once seen as a stabilizing force, had become deeply unpopular. Many citizens believed Paris was exploiting the conflict for its own geopolitical interests, using Burkina Faso as a pawn in a bigger game of influence in Africa. The trust was gone. The streets began to chant, "France dégagez, France get out." In this atmosphere of betrayal and abandonment, a new wave of patriotism began to rise, fueled not by government leaders, but by young soldiers and civilians who had lost everything. Traoré, still officially just a captain, became a rallying point. He wasn't yet a revolutionary, but in his quiet demeanor, people began to sense something different. A man of action, a man who stayed when others ran, a man unafraid to speak when others whispered. In January 2022, President Kabore was overthrown in a coup led by Lieutenant Colonel Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba. Traoré, at the time, didn't publicly support or oppose the move, but privately, he watched. Damiba had promised a return to security, promised to crush the insurgents, promised to be different. But months passed, and nothing changed. Villages were still under siege. The army was still losing ground. And worse, Damiba was accused of consolidating power, surrounding himself with loyalists, and ignoring the front lines. By August 2022, soldiers across the country were openly questioning Damiba's leadership. Frustration became discontent. Discontent turned into meetings. And in those meetings, a name kept coming up. Captain Ibrahim Traoré. Burkina Faso was already under military rule. The people had accepted it. Some even welcomed it. After all, the civilian government of President Roch Kabore had failed them, and Lieutenant Colonel Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba, the man who led the January 2022 coup, had promised a new era. But as the months passed, that promise began to wither. Despite his rhetoric, Damiba remained in the capital, far from the front lines. Reports from the ground said morale among troops had sunk lower than ever. Entire towns were under jihadist control. Civilians were being executed for cooperating with the army. Hunger and displacement were rising. And through it all, Damiba seemed distant, detached. He made appearances in diplomatic settings, met with French officials, and spoke of national dialogue. But on the battlefield, there was no dialogue, only silence and gunfire. Among soldiers, the whispers returned, this time louder, angrier, and directed straight at Damiba. And from those whispers, a young, soft-spoken artillery captain emerged. Captain Ibrahim Traoré. By late September 2022, Traoré had been quietly gathering momentum, holding private meetings with disillusioned officers, coordinating with frontline units, and listening to grievances. His message was simple. The people are tired. The army is tired. We cannot win this war from behind palace walls. He wasn't seeking power for fame. In fact, many say he never wanted to lead. But in a military hierarchy full of sycophants and silence, his courage to speak truth made him a lightning rod for hope. The tipping point came in the northern city of Djibo. Jihadist militants had surrounded the city, cutting off supply routes and food chains. The people inside were slowly starving. Soldiers stationed there sent repeated distress calls to headquarters, pleading for reinforcements and rations. Nothing came. Then a military convoy en route to Djibo was ambushed. Over a dozen soldiers were killed, and the remaining trucks were either destroyed or captured. Among the dead were young men, barely in their 20s, sent to die without proper backup. The nation mourned, but the army seethed. For Traoré and his allies, this was the final betrayal. On the morning of September 30th, 2022, explosions echoed across Ouagadougou. Gunfire erupted near the presidential palace, the RTB television station, and several military bases. At first, confusion reigned. Was this an attack by terrorists? A foreign plot? But within hours, clarity struck. Ibrahim Traoré had seized power. He and a group of junior officers had staged a second coup, not against a civilian president this time, but against Damiba himself, the very man who had claimed to be the solution. This was the coup within the coup, and it was swift. There were no public executions, no long speeches, no bloodbath, just a broadcast. In fatigues and surrounded by solemn-faced soldiers, Captain Traoré addressed the nation from behind a wooden desk. We have decided to take our responsibilities with the sole aim of preserving the security and integrity of our territory. There was no arrogance in his voice, no triumph, just a quiet urgency. To many Burkinabe, it was a moment of déjà vu, but also a spark of renewed hope. Burkina Faso has seen revolution before. In the 1980s, a charismatic young leader named Thomas Sankara seized power with bold dreams of African unity, anti-imperialism, and grassroots development. He spoke of dignity, of justice, of breaking the chains of colonialism. He was called Africa's Che Guevara, But in 1987, Sankara was assassinated in a coup, silenced but never forgotten. So when Ibrahim Traoré, a 34-year-old captain, appeared on national TV in 2022 and began to echo Sankara's tone, people noticed. He didn't wear the polished suit of a statesman. He didn't speak like a politician. He didn't promise a utopia. Instead, he gave something far more rare: intentional humility and a call to action. We are not here to enjoy power. We are here because the country is in danger. That line was repeated everywhere, in markets, in villages, in youth, WhatsApp groups. To many, it felt like the return of a lost voice. But unlike previous regimes, Traoré wasn't looking to appease the West. He wasn't playing by their rules. Within weeks of taking power, he made radical shifts. Burkina Faso had long been seen as part of France's précaré, its sphere of influence in West Africa. French troops operated in the country under the banner of counter-terrorism, but their presence had done little to stop the insurgencies. In fact, many Burkinabés saw it as a new form of occupation. Traoré acted swiftly. He terminated military agreements with France, ordered the closure of French military bases, and demanded the withdrawal of French troops. His government banned French state broadcaster RFI and later France 24, accusing them of misinformation and neo-imperial narratives. This wasn't just policy, it was symbolism, a generational severing of the colonial cord. If France is not ready to treat us with dignity, then we will build with those who do. In an era where many African leaders remained quietly dependent on Paris, Traoré roared back against the tide. But Traoré's revolution wasn't just about breaking old ties. It was about building new ones. He began strengthening relations with Mali and Guinea, two other West African nations also under military rule, who had similarly rejected France's influence. Together, they formed what many began calling a Pan-African military bloc, a partnership based on sovereignty first, not Western validation. In early 2024, the three countries withdrew from ECOWAS, citing the West African bloc's perceived hypocrisy and bias. Instead, they proposed a new union, the AES, Alliance of Sahel States, focused on regional security, anti-terrorism, and economic independence. Critics called it dangerous, supporters called it revolutionary, and young Africans, they called it inspiring. Traoré was no longer just a captain. He was fast becoming a symbol, not just in Burkina Faso, but across the continent. For many, the comparisons were unavoidable. Like Sankara, Traoré traveled in simple clothes, not luxury suits. Like Sankara, he challenged global institutions and foreign NGOs. And like Sankara, he placed the youth at the center of his vision. In interviews, he rarely refers to himself as president. Instead, he insists he is merely a soldier fulfilling his duty. And yet, his actions carry a much larger weight. He increased military recruitment, but not through force. Thousands of young Burkinabe volunteered, not just to fight, but to defend their homes, their farms, their future. He spoke not just of drones and bullets, but of rebuilding schools, clinics, and roads in neglected regions, restoring trust where the state had vanished. He reintroduced civic education campaigns, encouraging youth to read, debate, and participate in building a new national identity. This wasn't the old model of military dictatorship. This was something different. This was a new kind of revolution. Ibrahim Traoré has not yet written his final chapter, He could be the man who broke the cycle, or the next in a long line of broken promises. But for now, the youth still chant his name. The flag still flies high, and the revolution, whatever shape it takes, is still in motion. This is not the end of the story. This is just the beginning. Thank you for watching. Have a nice day. And until next time, peace. Don't forget to subscribe.